again, thank you everybody for listening and standing by. Go ahead, Charles.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. You know, just to begin with, to let you know that I am predominantly a real estate attorney. It comprises probably about 90% of my practice, and the remaining part of my practice is often tangential to the real estate, as you need to get involved at times with estate work, dealing with the surrogates court and things of that matter. So I've been doing real estate for 34 years. I've been an attorney for 39 years. I'm a graduate of Villanova Law School, and I have one attorney working with me, my son, who is with the office. We do have a website, which is arakelianlegal.com, and you can always look to the website if you want any information, contact information, etc., or information as to what we do at the office. So these are trying times. We all need to be aware of how, COVID-19, social distancing, and all these new factors and issues sort of play into our business. And obviously they affect almost every business out there, but obviously the real estate market is something that's affected greatly. And I'm really not going to get into the market itself. I mean, that's something that is a realtor's sort of area to really keep their eye on the ball and see what's happening with things like the prices and how the pandemic may be affecting real estate in any particular place or region. So there are typically a number of things that I tend to look at with this, and I think maybe it's best to start sort of all the way at the beginning, because Evelyne has told me that we may have people with a great deal of knowledge listening, and we may have some people who are relatively new as realtors that may be listening to this program as well. So the first thing I would say, when you get a client contacting you under the current environment, I think you really more so than ever want to connect with that client and know, what their interests are. So are they purchasing a single family home that they intend to live in? Are they purchasing a multifamily home they intend to live in a unit? Are they an investor strictly purchasing for rental? Or are they an investor purchasing to flip that property or to knock it down? And all those things are factors that go into how myself or you as a realtor would work with that client and what we would need to do through the process. So knowing all that background is relevant to knowing how to proceed with the transaction. When you draft the contract, there are 2 new forms that have basically come into play as a result of COVID-19. One of those forms is basically a hold harmless agreement. And what that really means is you want to make sure that you're not exposing somebody to the virus, or your client is not exposing anybody to the virus, and you want everybody to sort of go out there, inform and represent to the other party they're not ill with the virus. You want them to represent if they've been exposed to the virus, that they've quarantined for 14 days. And in this way, you're protecting everybody, and you're also in the process protecting yourself, because you don't want to ever be in a position where you may have liability for introducing people into a property, or having a buyer meet a seller and any kind of problem develop thereafter. The other form interestingly, goes to the contract itself. It's an addendum to the contract, which addresses the issue of what if there are delays caused in the closing process. It allows you to insert a time frame or a period of days that the contract may be delayed as a result of unforeseen circumstances resulting from the pandemic. Another aspect of that is a provision that protects the buyer if, for unknown reasons or unforeseen reasons related to COVID-19, your client secures their mortgage commitment and therefore would typically have satisfied the mortgage contingency. What happens if some factor relating to COVID-19 prevents the closure of that loan? So that provision in the addendum allows either buyer or seller, if the closing cannot take place because of a unforeseen issue with the COVID-19 preventing the loan from closing, to terminate that contract and the deposit to be returned to the buyer. Now, obviously, that's not a circumstance any of us want. Typically, we're all looking to work together to move these transactions to a closure. That's when realtors get their commissions, that's when attorneys get their fees, and that's when hopefully your client, whether they're the buyer or seller, walks away with a smile on their face. I have done litigation over the years. The one thing I always liked about transactional law when I started transitioning into it back in 1986 was the fact that unlike litigation where probably if the case had a good conclusion, neither party walked away happy. In a real estate transaction or in most transactional situations, hopefully both parties are walking away with a smile on their face. The seller walking away with their check in their hand and the buyer walking away with the keys to their new home in their hand. And that's what we're all looking for. And that's what's going to bring you repeat business. That client coming back for an investment property, that client coming back to sell another property, or that client coming back to buy a vacation home. So what you really want to do is work with a good group of professionals in each aspect of what you're doing, whether it's the attorney, whether it's the realtor, whether it's the home inspector, the mortgage person who's processing that loan. You want to have a good group of people that are well versed in what they're doing, particularly at this time, to make sure that the transaction goes smoothly, that the party or the client is happy with the services that you've rendered, happy with the services of anyone that you may have recommended. And that brings us to the question of, as a realtor, you have a signed contract. That contract, obviously, we should all know, is subject to a 3-day attorney review. And at that time, you're often asked to refer an attorney or attorneys to represent your client, whether the buyer or seller. Now, some of the time, obviously, you will not have that ability. Your client may tell you, they have an attorney that they've already have a relationship with and wish to use that person. You may just want to explain to them at that point that if that attorney is not well versed in real estate, they may want to consider for their transaction an attorney that you recommend. And typically you're going to give a list of 3 attorneys roughly that you feel are competent and you work well with to handle that transaction for your client. It is a personal decision typically for the realtor as to how much they talk about the realtors. I have many realtors that I have personally represented, and they will often inform, their client that, here's a list of 2 or 3 attorneys. However, I can tell you that Mr. Arakelian, in this example, is well versed, and I have personally used him as attorney for myself in real estate transactions. Uh, Obviously, a personal endorsement like that, for whatever attorney you may be working with, will be a powerful endorsement. There are issues to keep in mind when you have that 3-day attorney review that, the client, you need to make sure selects their attorney promptly so the attorney has time to actually complete that review. It is important that the attorney get a letter out within 3 days, which is what the 3-day attorney review is all about. It's almost a misnomer because it's not 3 days to complete the whole process. It's 3 days to either accept the contract as is or to reject it. And typically, if it's rejected, you're offering a rider or an addendum to the contract that you believe makes that contract acceptable to your client. Now, I would say up until a few years ago, it was very common for me as a seller's attorney not to really get involved in doing a rider from the seller's side. However, transactions have gotten a little more complicated where I not only typically do a rider from the buyer's side, but if I'm representing the seller, I will do a rider from the seller's side. Obviously, the seller side of a transaction is a lot more streamlined, and particularly, it may sound kind of funny, but I often say, from a seller side, all we're worried about is how much is the purchase price and when are we closing? From a buyer's side, obviously the concerns are much greater because, that person's walking away with the keys to the house and they want to know the roof isn't leaking, the basement isn't taking in water, and the plumbing, electrical, and heating systems are all going to function the way they should be. So obviously the protection that needs to go into what an attorney does from a buyer's end is a bit more sophisticated and a bit more involved than it would be from the seller side. And that's why you'll typically find that an attorney will charge a somewhat higher fee if they're representing the buyer than if they're representing the seller. And of course, all those things are subject to the particular transaction. Obviously, if you have a transaction where the seller is in a state and you start getting involved in clearing up estate issues and things like that, the seller side of the transaction may be a much more expensive fee than it would be from the buyer's side.
Mm-hmm.
The 3-day attorney review process, I generally try and get it started within 24 and like 48 hours, the latest. You want to get that rider out there as a buyer. Typically, if I'm representing the seller, I'm preparing my rider, but I'm waiting for the buyer to send me his so that I'm responding to his and including those few items from a seller side that I'm concerned about. On the buyer side, the most important things I'm trying to look at are things that may not be fully covered in the contract that the realtor's form provides for. I'm looking at extra protection if we find an underground oil tank, particularly if there's leakage, if we find a tank that's been decommissioned but left in place. The current, I would say view on that is we still want that tank removed. So a seller who 10 years ago either bought the house or decommissioned the house or purchased the house or decommissioned the tank and that tank was left in the ground, most of those homeowners are finding that at this point they're going to be asked to remove that tank even though they may have proper documentation that it was decommissioned in place. So I always advise clients to do a tank sweep. If we don't know really the history of the property, it's an inexpensive inspection to do, and it's just an important item. I also add language about other environmental issues, be they asbestos, mold, items like that. I also cover the issue, God forbid, that the purchaser should decease during the course of the transaction. Uh, you really want to make sure that your client's uh, spouse or heirs are not bound by that contract per se, and if the unlikely were to happen, that they could exit the contract without harm. Uh, so all those things go into the rider. My rider typically is about 2.5, 3 pages long from the buyer side. From the seller side, just trying to confirm certain things in the contract, such as that the buyer is not looking to sell another piece of property in order to come up with the funds to close. If that's the case, if you're drafting a contract from a buyer standpoint and you know your client has to sell, you really should put that out there and make the seller aware and not spring it on them as a surprise. So that's something you really want to work out ahead of time. And then I want to make sure, for technical legal reasons, that my client, can rely on all the expectations of the timeline of when we're going to be selling. And then, once we're out of attorney review, which basically means both sides have gone over each other's riders, signed off and agreed to terms, that's when we have completed attorney review. That's when the realtor can now mark the property as out of attorney review and under contract. And once you get to that point, that is when we typically come up to the home inspections. And this is another area where I think, because of COVID-19, you really need to do your homework. It's really with every aspect of the transaction that things may be affected and delayed. So what you want to make sure, number one, is if you're doing a pre-approval at the time of the contract, you want to make sure, maybe touch base with your client's lender to see, what problems they're experiencing, if any, with COVID-19, what new or unusual guidelines or requirements have they added to their loan process. One of the major banks came out over the weekend and indicated that their new policy was going to be that they were going to require 20% down on residential real estate mortgages and scores in the 700s and up. So, that may significantly affect who may qualify. So you want to know, when your client is putting that offer in, that that's a genuine pre-qual they have, and it's from a lender who can deliver that loan. Obviously, that's one of the reasons why we like to know who the mortgage person is, who the lender is. And, if you do enough real estate, you tend to know a lot of the regulars, and you can breathe a sigh of relief when there's a mortgage processor and a mortgage company on the other side of that transaction that you can count on, that they're not the kind to take an application and deny a loan, that if they take an application, they know they can do that loan.
Right.
So that's part of the homework you want to do up front during that contract process. Also, before we get out of attorney review, you want to know what inspectors are out there that are willing to inspect at this time, given all the problems with COVID-19 and social distancing. So who's willing to go into the house and under what conditions? Do they want the house vacant? Are they willing to have the buyer accompany them? The tradition is the buyer attends the inspection. I always encourage that, because I think the inspector can give insight to the buyer as they walk through, something that the buyer sees in the report, if they're not there, that may spook them about the transaction and create some fear of going forward. oftentimes if they're at the inspection and are talking to the inspector, they can get a better feel for what's really an important issue and what's not. And all too often we see clients that may get a little too much anxiety about a particular item in a home inspection that really, from experience, you and I may know should not be considered that terrible an issue. So it's always good if you can do your homework, know what inspectors, particularly given this COVID situation, and under, like I said, what conditions they will do the inspection, who they will allow to be present. A lot of times, I really can't say the percentage. Realtors would know better than I would on this, but homeowners might like to be present. The seller might want to be present. That may not be a good thing at this time. So we need to consider how we're changing the norm of what we're doing in our business to facilitate this. A buyer may decide, hey, under normal conditions, I'd like to be there, I would be there, but I, as their attorney, would be much more understanding today if a client said to me, I choose not to be present for the home inspection. And as far as inspections go, it's always nice to also know, just in general, that your inspector is using all the capabilities that are available today. One of the things that I think is a great item for inspectors to be using, particularly with regards to seeing the condition of a roof, is the use of a drone. So we now see inspectors that will fly drones over the house to, see video of what the condition of the roof looks like. Some years ago, you would have some home inspectors that would actually do what we call walk the roof. That is a practice that has basically totally disappeared because they would typically potentially do a lot more damage than they were doing good. So the use of a drone, for instance, becomes very, insightful for us in these days when these technologies are now here and available to us. Just excuse me 1 second while I get a sip of water.
I'm just wondering, Charles, are you finding any deals that you're doing currently that are actually using drones? And if you are, what are the regulations and restrictions that, the government is imposing in these times regards to drones? I think that they're a great idea for exterior inspections, of course, but we are finding that on, county by county basis for interior inspections, the rules have are very different and kind of all over the place. But with exterior inspections, are you in fact finding that there have been any drone inspections since this outbreak?
Since the outbreak, I have not seen their use. And I would say that maybe more due to the drop in volume. I've had contracts come in, and then I've had contracts get terminated. There's been so much turmoil in the marketplace that I'm trying to think if I have any particular transaction right now in the inspection phase. The last one I had done, they did not use a drone. My understanding as far as the usage of a drone, I believe it's the FAA has set guidelines of what drones are required to be registered, and I don't even know, there may even be a requirement for like flight plan for some of these larger drones. But it really doesn't take a very large or sophisticated drone to do what needs to be done for the home inspection. I know my son got a drone a couple years ago, and it was probably not more than $100 or $150 drone, which took high definition video and certainly was capable of flying over, a roof of the house. Now, you really today probably have much more sophisticated devices because at that time, a couple years ago, they were very limited in the duration of the flight due to the battery power. Mm-hmm. Obviously, as time has gone on, they've become more sophisticated, and better drones with longer flight times are available.
Mhm.
Uh, but I think we're gonna probably find that in a few years, it's it's more common to find it than not have it.
Right, right.
And I think it's just a useful tool. Just like years ago, we saw very few photos with these inspections. And then with the advent of the digital camera, now I'm dating myself, but with the use of the digital camera, sometimes we almost get too many photos in the home inspections.
Yeah.
I received a home inspection not that long ago, which was 200 pages long with all the photos. And, from my viewpoint as an attorney, I think that's overkill. I really question the need for any home inspector to generate a 200-page report on a residential property.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's
but
crazy.
be that as it may.
Yeah.
So that really brings us through to the concept of really being prepared in advance, given what's going on with COVID-19, to know what's available. If you need an environmental company to come out and do an oil tank sweep, who's doing those currently? Are they, what companies are willing to operate under these conditions? Uh, Typical oil tank sweep, they would, look outside the property, look for vent pipes, use metal detectors, use some sonar equipment to check areas that would typically be places where an underground tank would be on the property. But then they would also do an interior inspection of the basement to look for piping coming through the walls or floor, which would be a telltale sign of a tank. Whether or not they're willing to go in the property, again, is something that I'm sure is a case-by-case basis with each, environmental company that you may call and inquire about an inspection. So
Are you
it
finding
really,
any environmental companies being requested to do environmental inspections at this time specifically? You personally, have you heard of any that you can share with us, or not necessarily?
I have one, and I haven't seen the report come in. So I'll be curious when it does come in, the extent of the inspection, again, whether they opted to go and do an interior of the basement as well. Uh, and I think obviously we need to make sure when we're setting these things up that you do also question the inspector to make sure that they are coming in with all the proper safeguards, that they're going to be wearing gloves, they're going to be wearing a face mask, all these things. I think if we carefully read, Governor Murphy's orders are now mandatory, but I think it's appropriate to make sure that for your protection as a realtor who may be facilitating the inspection, that you confirm that all the proper precautions are going to be taken by, the individual coming in.
Right. And then would the this hold harmless form that we spoke about earlier, how prepared are the courts? Do you know? And I can answer that almost myself. I can almost say they're not. But how prepared would they be at this particular moment in time to deal with a hold harmless controversy right now, if it were to be presented in their courts?
I think that's really is an open question. Uh, and the problem with the courts is often we don't find out until they make a decision on something. There's very little guidance. In fact, the typical as how could I put it, as uninstructful as it is, the courts have this rule against ruling on something that's a hypothetical. So if we went to the courts today and said, look, we're concerned about what we can put in a hold harmless or the enforceability of the hold harmless, what is the court's stance? The current judicial stance is we don't give opinions. We only decide cases. So they will not accept hypotheticals as to interpretations of law or interpretations of contracts. So it's an unfortunate situation that we can't get those kinds of advisory opinions. However, I think the experience of the person drafting these agreements, I am sure the real estate boards are consulting with attorneys they have used over the years that have helped them draft these contracts. And, I would be fairly confident in the draftsmanship of these agreements. And I would certainly wholeheartedly recommend that everyone use these addendums and not go forward without them. I think it would be a terrible mistake just to do business as usual without, trying to protect yourself and your office by using all these provisions. In fact, before any of these addendums were drafted, as the virus started to become something that became part of our thought process, started introducing COVID language into my own riders on my own to protect clients if there were delays in home inspection periods and things like that, or in closing dates to protect them, to say if there's delays due to COVID-19, those are going to be acceptable to a reasonable extent. And, so I had adopted that own, sort of language into my riders just as an initial protection as we started going forward with deals and this started to come to the forefront.
So for example, if a customer or a client is ready to move and they've got a moving truck scheduled, even though technically they shouldn't have that in place right now, but they go ahead and they do it anyway. And then, the moving truck says, well, I'm scheduled and I have a contract with this customer to move them today. And you say, well, that you can't or whatever. I mean, how does that come into play anywhere?
Well, I think that is part of the problem. And I think that's something I know you and I discussed the other day as to, the impact this may have. It's sort of one of those hidden impacts where it may not be in the front of our minds as we go about our daily work on these closings. And then suddenly you wake up to the fact that, wait a second, my client's called around and no moving company is willing to schedule a move during this time. Right. Now, how do I vacate the property because I have a closing next week? Well, God forbid I have a time of the essence closing for next week. And, these are all things that are going to get, unfortunately, if they come up, hashed out in the courts, if people are unreasonable about it. And that's why, again, I think going all the way back to the beginning of our discussion about selecting an attorney, there's the need to make sure you're working with a transactional attorney who understands not to try and posture into litigation, but right, try and find reasonable solutions to novel problems that we encounter. And you and I know, even before COVID-19, real estate generates all kinds of novel problems. I mean, I've been doing this for 34 years, and it never ceases for me to encounter some new issue or problem that never came up before. So, I mean, we're used to dealing with novel problems. Of course, this just presents a whole myriad of new problems all at one time.
Yeah. So I've been actually just advising my clients to try and enlist family members that they're very close to. Everybody show up with your car and take what you can a little at a time and try to get, a little bit of mercy on the seller side that, are on the buyer side that, will pick up that which has not been removed, in a reasonable amount of time. Just please have some patience. So we're kind of trying to advise our clients to be more organic, if you will, on that front, just so as nobody gets into trouble. If there is like a whole harmless thing in place where somebody can point the finger, if it's in the family nucleus, then it's less likely maybe to come up where, the problem would be presented. And, just try to figure it out amongst yourselves to move what you need and leave what you don't until a better day.
Right.
And have that all worked out.
Yeah. And I think, one of the notes I made to myself for today's discussion was, about the walkthrough.
Yeah.
That presents a whole number of issues. But my real thought about the walkthrough is to really be working with your customer as a seller, that they understand, the time frames. The house needs to be empty. Like you say, they could be moving out over a course of 1 or 2 weeks slowly. They need to dispose of whatever rubbish and trash. It's got to be a broom clean premises. Now, again, like you just mentioned, we can ask a buyer to be somewhat flexible and reasonable and say, look, there's a pandemic going on. We need to have your cooperation. We would normally have cleared out everything, but in this particular case, we would like you to accept a reasonable amount of rubbish left behind that you can clean out when this whole thing is over. And maybe you make a monetary compensation over it. But my fear is, as we move forward with these deals, I guess where maybe I can say the biggest impact of COVID-19 is in the closing process is actually when you get to the day of closing.
Right.
And what we're trying to do is basically close these deals with as few people present as possible.
Right.
The day of closing and having the seller present with his attorney, with both realtors and family members of the buyer who are all there to help them celebrate this grand event of them purchasing their first home, the parents there or the children there. That all obviously has been something we've rethought at this point. The last couple closings I've done, one, the lender was terrific. They took the bull by the horns, and they had the buyer sign everything electronically the day before closing, with the exception of the note and the mortgage. So that the only things that needed to be executed at the closing table were the note, the mortgage, and the settlement statement. That so streamlines the closing process. And that's really something I think we need to try and get as many lenders on board with.
Yeah, I agree.
Going to the closing table is, unfortunately something, we, again, I think I said early on, the wonderful thing about these transactions, at least from an attorney's standpoint, is it's a happy event, not like litigation. So it's unfortunate that the realtor can't be there to sort of embrace their client and send them off from the closing, as a happy client, shaking hands and hugging and maybe taking a photo for your Facebook page. But, at least for the time being, that's obviously something we have to do away with.
Right.
So even from a seller standpoint, I've been a real traditionalist. Clearly, the movement has been for sellers to pre-sign their documents and for either the seller's attorney just to appear without his client, or for the seller's attorney not even to appear but just send his documents to the table the day before. Like I said, I've been a traditionalist. I've been trying to attend all of my closings as much as possible, barring conflicts with other closings. But at this point, I think it's only reasonable for all sellers' attorneys to have their documents executed in advance, to have them delivered to the settlement agent, whether that's the title company or the closing attorney, the day before closing, and handle the transaction in that manner. And the seller's funds can either be overnighted in the form of a check, or they can be wired to the seller. And the same is true with the commissions and the attorney's fees. On one occasion recently, I had my fee wired to my account. In another one that's coming up, by happenstance, the title company happens to be down the street from my office. So I can just have them drop it in my mailbox for me.
Right. Are you finding, though, that in these times, I mean, typically in other states, and I can say, thank God, at least not in New Jersey, at least not thus far, with, looting and things of that nature occurring as a result of these types of organic, uh, catastrophic pandemics, the virus. Are you feeling that that wire security is still solid and has not been tampered with? And can we expect to still find some comfort knowing that our customers' monies are still secure in these times?
Right. Well, we all know, or we all should know, that wires have been subject to a lot of fraudulent problems.
Right.
Uh, so I don't think there's any attorney who does real estate that hasn't had a transaction where they've seen an attempt to have a wire misdirected to a fraudulent account. That being said, there's simple precautions that render the wire transfer completely safe. And that is a simple telephone call. There really should be no wire sent anywhere by anybody who doesn't first pick up the telephone and call the recipient and verify both the routing number and the account number.
Okay.
And there is an untold number of attempts to, send wires or get wires sent to fraudulent bank accounts, but it's that one telephone call that really ensures that everything's going where it should be. And frankly, I deal with a handful of title companies. I don't deal with one company, I deal with several. And even if I know their wires, I call them up and go through that motion of verifying.
It's an extra little bit of protective measure. In
Yes.
these times, you have to find the nuances that are going to separate you from the rest to ensure the comfort and the security of your clients. So I think that's terrific, Charles. Yeah. I mean, whatever we're missing the last 60 to 90 days, hopefully it's not going to last forever. These things will, resume back to some kind of normalcy. But in these times, it's really important to know who, you're working with, who's in your back pocket, who's got your back, how protective, are they with your transaction in these new times? What new measures have they taken? Have you discussed those measures with them to ensure full transparency all around 360? So I think that, it's important to hear what Charles is saying and take note, take heed to that when selecting an attorney to work with, because obviously that'll be the difference between keeping the deal, done properly or falling apart somewhere, or in a worst case scenario, God forbid, having a lawsuit later on, and no hold harmless will protect you in these courts.
Well, that's a good point. And I think the real point too, when we have these discussions and talk about the preparation and making sure these things close well, is none of us want to be involved in litigation.
No.
So, the ounce of prevention is always worth the pound of cure. We don't want to be there. When we deal with these contracts, we always say disclose, disclose, disclose. If there's doubt, disclose. If you're asking the question of whether or not something should be disclosed, that tells you the answer right there. So you never want to be saying, well, I thought it was a gray area, because you'll wind up in litigation over it. And that's the thing you don't want to do. So
Ignorance
from our
is
standpoint
not
in
an
doing these
excuse.
deals,
Ignorance is never an excuse.
no.
Are you finding too that on any deals that you're doing right now, on a county by county basis, what the differences are? Is there some kind of uniformity across the board regards to, I don't know, deaths, for example, and what happens in the case where if somebody passes away? Maybe that's a little too specific. Just, I guess, maybe in general, are you dealing with the counties by email more? Are you finding that they're all cooperating? Are they all on the same page?
Uh, I think pretty much at this point they're all on the same page. There was a point in time when counties were sort of closing down in certain fashions. You know, for instance, Bergen had closed to the public as far as the county records for real estate.
Is that now? Not now, in this time.
That's now. They're closed
Wow. Yeah.
for the public. So
Yeah.
now if I were to hire a searcher and say, go, and now this is across the board, all 21 counties, go to the county and search this for me, they can't do it. Public is not allowed in. The office is open. The people who staff and do the recording in the county are there working, and they're putting new deeds into the public record, and they're doing all the functions they would normally do. However, you can't walk in the door and do anything. You can't do searches. It is absolutely essential as a seller to find your title policy from when you purchase the house, if at all possible. The longer someone's owned that house, the more unlikely it is that the searcher would be able to perform an adequate title search online, which means you would not be able to close that deal. So if you had somebody who's owned the home for 40 years or it's out of an estate, you would not be able to complete that search unless you have an owner's title policy. So that's one item that's become essential that, you know, I try and alert the client from the very outset of a deal. You know, these are the documents that would really be helpful if you can find a copy of your deed, a copy of your survey, but more important than anything, your owner's title policy from when you purchased. So we may find as we go forward that there are times we cannot complete title searches and we will not be able to close deals until the office reopens to the public and to searchers. Now, I think there may well, you know, we don't know what's going to happen as far as a second wave of this virus. So we may have a situation where we have a reopening of these government offices and we can get searches done, but then 5 months or 6 months from now, we're back to closing the office to the public. So I think it's essential that, number one, all of us be prepared to work from home. You know, we're doing it now, and anybody that's on this Zoom conference obviously has probably everything they need to work from home. And really all you need is your cell phone, a computer, an internet connection, and a multifunction printer. And literally you can scan, fax, and do anything. I can do everything I could do in my office here from home. Right. The only thing I can't do here is bulk scanning, which is really unnecessary in the short run. So typically when I close a file, the same day or the next day, that file is scanned into our computer system. So if I get a phone call from a client who says my accountant needs that closing statement, I don't have to dig a file out of archives come April when they make that request, because invariably half the clients lose the closing statement I give them at closing. So come tax season between January and April, I'm flooded with phone calls asking me for copies of closing statements. With the files archived on the computer, it's a very quick process for me to pull up that client's file and email them a copy of their closing statement. So it's a wonderful thing. It makes working from home easy because anything that comes up, again, I can respond very quickly to that client I've already closed for, give them any kind of copies or look up any question and answer any question they may have from their old file.
Yeah, we've all become digital nomads out of just sheer necessity and
right.
The way of the world right now.
And I think what you need to do, I think we should all be proactive for the future to say, if we need to do this again, you know, just make sure by happenstance, I fortunately had gone to Staples and stocked up on a 2-pack of the toner for my printer at home, and I made sure when I left the office, I took, 5 reams of paper with me. So even though I go to the office, I'm a mile from my office. So I stop in the office usually on a daily basis just to see if there's any mail in the mailbox that I need to pick up and any faxes on the fax machine. But, I don't really need to do that on a daily basis. And as far as work getting done, we really need to make sure we're prepared to do everything we need to do from the house.
Right.
And I think we're really all probably there because fortunately, all the technology is so reasonable in cost that there's no reason not to have it available at home.
Right. Okay, so Charles, I just wanted to say at this time we're going to open it up for a Q&A. If anybody in our meeting today has any questions, Mr. Arakelian will not send you a bill. Please do raise your hand, or if you'd like, just go right ahead and chime in. Mr. Arakelian, I'm sure, would be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. Do we have any questions right now?
I do. This is Jeffrey Groth.
Hi, Jeffrey. Thank you. Yes, for
Hello,
Mr.
everybody.
Arakelian. Jeffrey, Charles, Jeffrey is working for a title company for many years, and maybe the two of you guys can meet later on. But go ahead, Jeffrey. Ask your question.
I would like that. Thank you. Charles, I'm interested in your legal opinion regarding the remote notary. That's my first question, your opinion of it, and what the legal risks are, but also why you think that most of the states in the Northeast have approved of it, but not yet in New Jersey. Those are my questions.
Well, as I understand, the bill has passed the state Senate and the state Assembly, which would put it figuratively on the governor's desk. I did not check. I actually had meant to check this morning to see what the status of that bill was and if the governor had signed it yet. I'm a little disappointed in the bill insofar as it does not include attorneys. It only includes notaries who are approved in the statutory process. Attorneys are notaries de facto by the fact that they're attorneys in good standing in the state. And I'm also disappointed in the Bar Association, chimed in about the legislation that it also is not available specifically for the use of wills. So I'm not really quite sure what to make of the legislation. It seems a little bit cumbersome to me, and maybe it's just my lack of familiarity and seeing it put to use. But my understanding is, according to the statute that they're proposing, is that the notary would have to make a video and audio recording of the transaction. Mm-hmm. And that would have to be stored. And I'm a little, I guess, intrigued by the notion that this needs to be done in that fashion and that needs to be stored, and all the legal implications of what happens if that gets deleted somehow, or what happens if the video recorded and the audio didn't, or vice versa. And where does that leave us? And I'm not sure if that isn't why the legislation specifically excluded its use on things like wills. I haven't really spoken to anybody who is in a jurisdiction that uses this process, and I'm not sure if that is the norm in every state, that they would preserve a video and audio recording of it. But I think it remains to be seen what happens. I would presume that the governor is going to sign that legislation, and hopefully maybe the the Association of Notaries, whatever they may call themselves, has some setup where, the notaries in New Jersey can perhaps archive these things with them in a central location, so we feel that they are adequately preserved. Because it just seems like there could be a tremendous amount of litigation in the future over, those notaries, whether or not it was effectively done and enforceable.
That's a nice idea. I was going to ask you where, who would be responsible for holding that, those recordings.
Yeah, I think, we'll have to take a look at the final version of the legislation once the governor signs it and see, if I don't think there was any specific provision in the legislation that said who preserves it and where, which is, interesting because it really leaves it up to the individual in that case to, the individual notary to preserve it.
Interesting. We're also hopeful that he's going to waive the 90-day waiting period.
Right. The legislation would make no sense without it.
Definitely.
This is, it's already taken way too long to get through the process at this point.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So
Thank
you're
you
welcome.
for asking, Jeffrey. And Charles, I don't want us to overstay our welcome. You've been extremely gracious. We're at an hour now. And if no one else has any more questions, I just want to thank everybody for participating today. And I will be by separate email sharing Mr. Arakelian's email. If you'd like to reach out to him privately, I would recommend working with him, as I said, and seeing yourself firsthand. He's very easy to get along with. He's quite up to date on all the new rules and regulations, and I'm sure he's keeping himself thoroughly apprised of all the COVID-19 changes that we're all very, very much in the need of being in the know. So with no further ado, I want to thank you again, and I'm going to close out this meeting unless, Charles, you'd like to say one more thing?
Well, the only thing I would say is I think pretty much everything has become very uniform because of the fact that the title companies have primarily been serving as the closing agents these days. And we're seeing a lot of these transactions closing outdoors. So I know title companies have set up like patio tables at their offices. I have done outdoor will signings in my parking lot. So we're all adapting very quickly to the process.
We certainly are. And again, as I said before, the last 60 and 90 days is not, gone forever. Things will be back to some sort of norm. And, with that, we can just be confident and keep plugging away, make the adaptations and stay positive. And have a great day, everybody. Thank you again for joining us. From Living Great Real Estate, I'm Evelyne Cohen, and hopefully we'll see you again very soon for our next meeting. Thanks again for all joining. I'm going to close this meeting now.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.